Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam, and I'm here pretending to have so much energy for you guys because I am exhausted. I was telling Drew before we began that I've been up since 5 in the morning, so I'm feeling a come to Jesus moment in this debate. If I'm exhausted and I wake up a Christian tomorrow, then you'll know that I may renege on anything I agree to in this stream. So let us know we have a new setup going. So let us know in the chat if there's any problems with the audio. We are going to be debating, does God exist? I did a stream this weekend with Esther and Trip, and it was an interesting talk. I mean, most of my channel is trying to have these talks in a civil manner. I don't know that that's good for our subs. So Drew and I are actually pretty good friends. So I feel like I might be able to yell at him and get away with it. So
Just go for it, man.
I forgot to ask you. It's funny too because I set this up backwards. I have your. I'm so exhausted that I have your name under my photo and you're over my photo.
Nice, man.
And I pitched you as a psychology grad student. That's correct, right? You're in grad
I'm
school.
currently working on my master's in adult clinical mental health counseling, so it's like close enough. I mean, it makes sense. I have my undergrads in psychology.
Yeah, it wouldn't seem right to call you an undergrad.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Drew is taking the affirmative. I am taking the negative, which means my only obligation here is to shoot down all of Drew's arguments effectively. Let's see if I can do it.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I have an opening statement here. So yeah, I'll just read this and then we'll move from there. All right.
Let's do it.
All right, so to open, I would like to acknowledge something up front, which is I'm about to argue for the existence of God based on 3 arguments. Those will be Anselm's ontological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and Kalam's cosmological argument. I'm going to do this to demonstrate that there are reasonable arguments to be made for the existence of God, but I want to make clear up front that my belief in God is not predicated upon the following arguments. I think it is important to discuss arguments for and against the existence of God for the sake of trying to find truth, but for me, a completely intuitive human being, to suggest I believe in God because I was convinced to believe in him by arguments would be dishonest. I believe in God primarily because of personal experience and because I genuinely believe in my heart that God exists. I have faith that my sins were paid for through the sacrifice of a man named Jesus long ago. I'm only making this for clarification's sake because I want to make sure that the people understand up front that I believe that the debate for this topic is important, but ultimately I care about faith overall. With that being said, I will move on to the actual arguments so I can utterly destroy my small-minded lefty friend here.
Ad hom in the intro.
Yeah, man. You think I wasn't going
to
go
just
for it?
Woke me up.
Good. I want you awake.
Hold on. While I've already interrupted you, you had the Kalam, the fine-tuning, and what was the other argument?
Anselm's ontological argument.
The what?
Anselm's ontological argument.
Okay, ontological. Gotcha.
Yeah, and I'm going to list those arguments in order. I'm going to address some typical objections to them, but I'm going to list out some premises. If you need me to repeat the argument when it's time for you to respond, just ask and I'll repeat the premises to you so you can write them down.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to give 2 versions of Anselm's ontological argument here. So the first premise of the first one is it is a conceptual truth, or so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be conceived. That is, the greatest possible being that can be imagined. The second premise is God exists as an idea in the mind. The third premise is a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. That is the greatest possible being that does exist. Premise 5, we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible thing that can be imagined, therefore God exists. The second formulation of this argument is as follows. Premise 1, by definition, is God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. A being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. Thus, by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in reality, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God. Thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, then God exists in reality. 12, God exists in the mind as an idea, therefore God exists necessarily in reality. Okay. So I'm going to touch on two objections here that are common to this argument. They're the typical ones that happen in the philosophical community. And then I'm going to move on to the next argument, the fine-tuning argument, and then after that, the Kalam's cosmological argument. So the first objection comes from a colleague, I believe, of Anselm at the time, from a guy named Guanillo. And this objection is the island example. If you're familiar with these arguments, this is the island objection. So I'm going to state the argument, and then I'm going to essentially argue that it is a disanalogy because of something called intrinsic maximums. So the first premise of the Guanillo argument, let me lay this out. So the Guanillo argument is essentially arguing that it is absurd to say that we can prove that God exists this way because we could prove the existence of a perfect island this way. So I'm going to give this example and give my response to it. So premise one, it is a conceptual truth that a pyland is an island, that than which none greater can be imagined. That is the greatest possible island that can be imagined. Premise two, a pyland exists as an idea in the mind. Premise three, a pyland that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is greater than a pyland that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, if a pyland exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine an island that is greater than a pyland that is the greatest possible island that does exist. But we cannot imagine that is an island an island that is greater than a pyland, therefore a pyland exists. So the idea here is that you could prove the existence of an island rather than the existence of God using the same structure of the argument. The problem here is that you run into something regarding intrinsic maximums. So I'm basically going to argue that arguing that a being that than which none greater can be conceived is not the same thing as arguing for an island that than which none greater can be conceived. So So let's talk about a couple properties of God. So let's just say all-knowing. So we're talking about an all-knowing being. There's an actual intrinsic maximum to how much you can know. When you talk about knowledge, there is a maximum number of things you can know because you could know all of the things. Now, when you're talking about an island, what happens here, let's say what you think makes an island good is coconuts. There's no intrinsic maximum to how many coconuts you can have to make the island better. So what you have is you can't actually have the idea of a greatest island because you can just infinitely say there's more and more coconuts on it. And the whole point of that is to say that trying to prove the existence of something that doesn't have intrinsic maximums is not the same as trying to prove the existence of something that does have intrinsic maximums, like a being like God, who is all good, all powerful, all knowing. So those things actually have intrinsic maximums. You can know all of the things. You can have all of the abilities. You can do anything possible. So there's a maximum to those that there isn't a maximum to the island objection. So that's why that analogy does not work, and that's why the objection fails in my view. Moving on to the Kantian objection, I'm just going to read the Kant's objection to this particular argument. It's in Kantian language, so I'm just going to explain it afterwards, but I think it's important to just state it in his own words. So this is him. Being is evidently not a real predicate. That is a conception of something which is added to the conception of some other thing. It is merely the positing of a thing or of certain determinations in it. Logically, it is merely the copula of an argument. The proposition God is omnipotent contains two conceptions which have a certain object or context. The word is no additional predicate. It merely indicates the relation between the predicate to the subject. Now, if I take the same subject, God, with all its predicates, omnipotence being one, and say God is, or therefore there is a God, I add no new predicate to the conception of God. I merely posit or affirm the existence of the subject with all its predicates. I posit the objection in relation to my conception. So the idea here is this is the typical that existence is not a predicate. I'm going to address this so I'll just address this. So the argument that existence is not a predicate, as mentioned in my previous debate with Tom Jump, is an objection that is held by a large portion of the philosophical community as an objection that defeats Anselm's ontological argument. But I reject the idea that consensus is important, and as I believe Adam will not press me on this point, like someone such as Tom Jump might, I'm not going to address the consensus issue unless Adam brings it up. So in the past, I talked to two of my previous philosophy professors who both have PhDs in philosophy about this particular objection. One of them said that he wasn't a Kantian and therefore didn't feel like he was comfortable commenting on the strength of this objection. The other one said that he thought it was frankly absurd and that he was shocked that the philosophical community actually accepted it. And the way I'm just saying that just for the record because I don't have a PhD in philosophy. I'm just showing that there are people in the philosophical community who think this objection fails. But moving on to specifically why I think it fails, I think it's important to acknowledge that the problem is is existence clearly adds something to it's clearly a property of something. So if you were a God that exists is different in kind than a God that does not exist. So to simply say that God or existence is not a predicate because it doesn't actually add anything to the thing is actually not true. A God that exists can interact with the material world in a way that a God that does not exist cannot. And because there's a difference between a God that exists and a God that doesn't exist, you can actually say that one is greater than the other simply by virtue of existing. So I realize I'm getting pretty close to 10 minutes here, but I'm going to go ahead and close out with the other two arguments. If you want to stop me at any point for time's sake, just let me know, Adam.
Well, I feel like one argument might be enough. Like
you feel like one might be enough?
You've talked for 10 minutes, and I don't know that I even understand your argument.
Okay,
so.
Then how about this? Why don't we just go ahead and talk about it first then?
Well,
rather than moving on.
We can move on to the second argument once we address this one.
Yeah.
So you're saying if God exists in the mind, then he exists, but don't unicorns exist in the mind? Do they actually exist?
A being that than which none greater can be conceived exists. So the idea is essentially that a being that than which none greater can be conceived exists in the mind, but a being that than which none greater can be conceived can't actually only exist in the mind. Is the problem, because a being that than which none greater can be conceived, because it's the best thing, has to exist by necessity.
Yeah, but best you're just placing a value on. Like what if a unicorn is the best thing that can be conceived of by me?
Then I would say you're not done with the thought experiment. But
that's your opinion. You're saying best, which is like a normative statement.
That's actually specifically why the argument doesn't say a being with XYZ characteristics has to exist. He says a being that than which none greater can be conceived, meaning the highest possible being has to exist by necessity because it has to exist in reality.
Why? That's just an assertion.
Well, it does by necessity because it's not the best if it doesn't exist.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
So because we can conceive of the best possible being, in order to be the best possible being, that being must exist. Isn't that argument circular?
It's not circular. It's not. It's not. It's valid, formally valid. I understand what you're getting at. The argument is not because you can conceive of something, that thing exists. That's not the argument.
Okay.
That's a common misunderstanding. The argument is that if you can conceive of a being that than which none greater can be conceived, that thing has to exist. That one thing only. It's not addressing an island or anything like that. The idea is that
if you can conceive of something that is better than any possible other thing, that thing must exist.
Yes, that thing.
Why? Like based on what?
Because if some. Okay, look. Do you know what? Okay, so this is actually. So when I was debating Tom Jump, part of the reason I was talking about something existing necessarily, meaning, so basically what that means is that it could not exist. So the best possible thing would have to exist because a property of that thing would be that it necessarily exists, meaning it can't not exist.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? And his response was existence is not a predicate, which is the correct response, which is basically existence is a
okay, I say that then. Existence is not a predicate.
Okay, then you would have to respond to my objection saying that existence changes something in kind. So basically what what this means is like, so like,
what are we talking about when we say God? Because you and I both believe that God is a concept.
Yes.
So that thing necessarily exists as a concept simply because we conceive of it.
It doesn't necessarily exist as a concept because if we didn't exist.
If we think of it, if
we think of it, then it's a concept, then then it's but if it would be contingent if it was like something that only we thought of, because if we didn't exist, then it wouldn't exist. But because it exists necessarily, it could not exist. Even if we weren't here, it would have to still exist.
So, and you're saying that things that we can think of that are lesser than God, like unicorns, they don't necessarily exist simply by the fact that they are not the best.
Yeah, so if something's not the best, then it doesn't have to exist, because if it's not the best thing,
this is crazy. This is crazy.
Just to be straight with you, this argument is completely unsatisfying. But all I would say is that
well, why are you bringing it then?
Because it's important, and the reason I bring it up is because it's an important argument. It's so important that Kant felt he had to address it, right? And
Right.
other people had to address it. Now, there's a reason that the philosophical community has an objection to this argument. It's not just that's insane, that's a fallacy. They're like it warrants a response because the argument actually works. It doesn't make sense for intuitive reasons, but I promise the argument works. Every time there's a philosophical conversation about this, it gets brought up because it's worthy of objection. Like you have to deal with it, or it just guarantees the existence of God. That's why everybody knows the existence is not a predicate thing, or the island example, because you have to respond to it. Otherwise, it just by fiat proves the existence of God just because of the way the argument is set up. It's totally counterintuitive.
What is the nature of this God that we're talking about, though? Because if you're
that's a separate conversation. I would say that a couple of the characteristics of a being like this would be like omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. So like all good, all knowing, all powerful, those kinds of things. But that's a completely separate discussion, independent of whether or not God exists. That's like what is God like, rather than what does God exist. Period. You know what I mean?
How does someone has never heard this argument come to embrace it? Because it seems farcical to me.
No one that hears this argument thinks that it convinces nobody. It's the most convincing argument of all time. Yeah, I fully acknowledge that. It's super unconvincing, but it works. Like,
but somehow it works. It's not working on me. I just want you to know.
No, I don't mean it works in terms of persuasion. I mean it works in terms of like it's logically valid, it's formally valid. It actually works philosophically. So like within the philosophical community, it's worthy of response because it does actually work. It's a valid thing. The premise is, or the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises. So you actually have to find a problem with one of the premises to make sure that you don't have to accept.
How many premises are there again?
In this particular version, let's see. In this particular version, there are 6.
Can we go through them together?
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is it is a conceptual truth, or so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being that than which none greater can be conceived. That is the greatest possible thing that we can imagine. So basically, God is it is a conceptual truth that God is a being that we view as the best possible thing. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
That's
all seeing, all knowing, all that stuff.
Yeah.
That seems. I'm cool with that one.
Yeah. Premise 2. God exists as an idea in the mind. You would also be good with that.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson God. Right there. I believe in that God.
That's premise,
God is a concept. I bet everyone in the chat believes in that God.
Yeah, everyone would agree with this. Premise 3 is a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality, other things being equal, is greater than a being that exists in mind only. So the idea is a being that exists in reality is greater than one.
This is hilarious. This is hilarious. These philosophers.
Would you agree that a being that exists in reality is greater than one that doesn't exist in reality?
Well, it's sort of just an assertion, but we'll for the sake of argument say okay.
Okay. All right. We cannot imagine something that is greater than God.
Unicorns, but that's the premise I have a problem with right there.
We can't imagine something greater than God?
Yeah.
So God is defined in premise 1.
Yeah, this is a completely definitional argument. It is, because like I was going to say, like a God that looks like a unicorn. Well, that would be better than God, so that is God. Like no matter what you imagine better, it becomes God.
Philosophical sliminess. I'm not denying that.
Why are you bringing slime to my channel?
I am just going to say flat out that you actually haven't defeated this argument. Like you have to like, okay, so
dude, this argument defeated itself when the guy wrote it down.
Okay,
I'm an empiricist. This is bullshit.
Okay, would you prefer to move on to?
No, I want to hear the rest of this laughable. The rest of the laugh.
No,
or is that's all the premises?
Okay, so just to be clear, you agree to premise 1. That God, or it's a conceptual truth that God is something that is greater than everything else that can be imagined. Okay,
so in this argument, God must exist, but we don't know anything about him. So therefore, he could just be God as a concept. Jordan Peterson would get around this argument easy by saying, okay, yeah, I do believe in that God. God must exist
You're
as a
misunderstanding the
concept.
argument.
Nietzsche believed this. He said if God, like, or was it Nietzsche? Who said if God didn't exist, we would need to create them? That's this argument right here.
No, it's not. It's not. Okay, so just to be clear, okay, so you agree that God is the greatest possible thing we can conceive of, right? So premise one, you agree with premise one?
Tacitly, I don't know. I'm super into jets. They seem a lot cooler than God, but is God an Autobot?
If you think he is, all that matters is that he's the greatest thing.
Okay.
All that matters is he's the greatest.
Okay.
And all I have to get you to
Optimus Prime and God. They're okay. I'm envisioning an Optimus Prime kind of God.
All I have to get you to accept is that God is the greatest thing that you can imagine of. That's all I have to get you to say. Okay?
Well, I believe it. Yes, that's true.
Okay. All right. So
you win. Okay. Next argument.
Okay. You want to move on to the fine tuning argument?
I think we understand. At least we understand this argument. People in chat are giving me a hard time because I've never heard this argument.
It's because it's not.
It's garbage. That's why I've never heard this.
So to be clear,
I'm reading science books.
So just to be clear, for everybody in the chat, this argument is worthy of addressing. That's why it's addressed in the philosophical community. That's why that we have objections to it that are commonly cited, and that's why it's brought up in like metaphysics classes and philosophy of religion classes, because it has to be addressed.
Oh my God!
No, I'm just saying it works and it warrants objection. You may think that the island objection works or that the existence not being a predicate thing works. And that's fine. So if those objections work, then the argument fails, but it's worthy of objection too. So just moving on.
What's different from this and the idea that we have 72 genders? Like, I don't understand that.
Well, it's totally unrelated.
I mean, this is philosophical mumbo jumbo.
I'm not denying this is mumbo jumbo, but it's formally valid, and therefore the premises guarantee the conclusion. So you actually have to attack on the premises for it to fail.
I got you. But but this argument, we have officially learned nothing about the nature of God.
Yes,
it's just intended to prove that there's something out there that we can imagine, and that thing that we imagine is like must exist just in the fact that it's the best. That's basically the argument.
Yes, that's what the argument is saying. It doesn't say anything about Christian God or what type. You might postulate, well, it has to have the three typical ones are like all powerful, all knowing, all good things. Maybe it has to have those three traits, but that's totally a separate discussion that independent of whether or not the argument works. That's a separate argument.
I like a God that doesn't talk a lot. So that's my best case scenario.
What is like our God then?
What was the argument what was the difficulty with this argument? What is the best argument against this argument?
The best argument against this, I think, is the existence is not a predicate thing. I don't personally understand how it works.
Okay.
I don't think the island example works at all because of intrinsic maximums. This is what I explained, but the existence not being a predicate one is the one that is typically accepted by people. I don't understand how it works because so for example, if I say that I'm imagining like a pile of cash right now. I think it's pretty clear that a pile of cash on my table in front of me is better than a pile of cash that I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
But the Kantian would say, actually, the fact that it exists changes nothing about the money because it's just saying that it does, which I think is crazy because money that exists in reality is different than money that exists in the mind, right? You see what I'm saying?
Oh, big time. I want the pile on my desk.
Now, that being said, I have a minor in philosophy, so there may be reasons that is totally fallacious, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this may be accepted for reasons that I'm not understanding. So that's just why I wanted to mention the typical objections in case you didn't hear this argument before, because I want to be clear that there are objections to this in the philosophical community. So,
do those objections help me win this debate? Because I want to destroy you.
I don't know, man. You don't seem to be
I'm not doing very good. I don't even really know the argument. What is what kind of God are you talking about? Just so we have an idea of the God that you're trying to prove.
So I believe in the Christian God, basically.
Right. Okay.
So like a God that can intervene in
a
history,
personal God.
Personal God.
Consciousness.
That has those three characteristics we were talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to move on to the fine-tuning argument here?
Fine tuning. I know how to combat this one at least.
Yeah. No, we can actually discuss this one. Okay. So the fine-tuning argument is as follows. The Earth is highly, finely, and conspicuously attuned to allow for the existence of human life. Premise 2. The fine-tuning facts are best explained and perhaps only explained by the existence of an agential designer. Premise 3, the best explanation or only available explanation of any fact is the one most likely to be true or must be true. Premise 4, for any fact there must be some true explanation for that fact, so it is most likely that there is an agential designer. If you need me to repeat those, I will.
No, I know the fine-tuning argument, and the problem with the fine-tuning argument is that, you know, weeds grow where the soil is fine-tuned for the weeds, but that's not really the case. There's plenty of places where it's not fine-tuned for the weeds to grow. They just happen to show up where the environment is perfect for them to show up. So the idea that we live in potentially a multiverse that has lots of different universes that are tuned incorrectly for life is the counter to that argument.
Okay, so first a couple things. So just for the audience sake, I'm going to list a couple of the fine-tuning facts that I referred to, just so people understand what I'm talking about, and then I'll address what your objection is. So
okay.
So basically the idea here is that there are certain constants in the universe, and then there are other things. So like some of the fine-tuning facts are, for example, like the distance from like the Earth's distance from the sun, all this kind of stuff. I'm not a huge fan of those because we may have it may just be the case that we would just have evolved on a planet that was around the same area like this. My concern with the fine-tuning facts are more like the ones that are regarding the existence of the universe itself, because we're not talking about an environment in which people are adapting to the environment they're in. We're talking about the environment never having existed in the first place. So there's not actually So I'll just move on to the fine-tuning facts, and then I'll address the multiverse thing. So one of the fine-tuning facts is the cosmological constant, which is the expansion rate of the universe. It could not have been varied by more than 1 in 10 to the 53rd power, or the universe would not be supportable. Meaning, if the expansion rate of the universe was any different than it was, then it would not exist. And it's extremely, extremely specific. We're talking like huge small decimal points, so it's incredibly unlikely that we had this particular constant that allowed the universe to exist. The second one would be like life as we know it depends on carbon and oxygen. If the balance of those two were off by 0.4% in the universe, almost all the oxygen or carbon in the universe would have been destroyed, meaning we couldn't actually see life begin to form. Another one is, according to the best current scientific theories, at the Big Bang, there should have been equal amounts of matter and antimatter, which means that our best theories would also suggest that the universe would instantly have destroyed itself, because there would have been equal parts of matter and antimatter. So basically, the idea is that scientific theories can't explain the existence of these fine-tuning facts, and they can't explain where the universe came from, is the idea. Now, addressing the multiverse theory. The multiverse theory is trying to get out of the improbability of the universe existing it's pretty much well acknowledged that the existence of like these particular facts, like fine-tuning facts, is incredibly strange that they were tuned this way. Even like pretty mainstream scientists acknowledge that there's something very weird going on here at the very least. And that's typically explained away by saying, well, if there's infinite universes and there's all these things playing out, then one of the universes has to have come up with this at some point, because there's an infinite numbers of them. So it decreases the likelihood that if there's one universe, it's incredibly unlikely that this were to happen. But if there are infinite universes, then it is bound to happen eventually, is the idea. The problem if you wanted to object by saying that there's multiple universes, then I would say, okay, well, there are multiple universes, and I would say that because God exists necessarily, and because we're in a multiple universes, that means that anything is possible, right? Because you have infinite universes, basically, right? Would you accept that anything's basically possible? There's infinite universes.
Well, we don't have proof of the multiverse, though. It's just a
like
postulation.
if I were just to like accept it,
right?
Would you say that basically anything's possible in infinite?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I would say to that is that it's possible that in one of those universes God exists, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. But because God exists necessarily, meaning he can't not exist. If he exists in one universe, he would have to exist in all universes.
If he wants to be the best. I see why you're bringing all these. I see why you're bringing all these arguments out now. Yeah. You're like stacking the deck against me here. All I want is tangible proof. I'm an empiricist.
Okay, well, we have to deal with likelihoods, right? Because this is basically an unfalsifiable thing.
God is an unfalsifiable claim.
Yeah, because there's also
what I just want to bring up, because you had talked about carbon-based life being
Yeah.
like the Earth or our universe is fine-tuned for carbon-based life, and I agree with that. But we don't know if the tuning was off, that we would be fine-tuned for some other type of life, or silicon-based life, or even some kind of atoms that we don't even know of. Like if the smallest atom that could be created was like 10,000 subatomic particles, then we would have a much different universe than we actually have here.
Yeah. Okay.
All it takes for evolution to get going is reproduction, selection, or reproduction, variation, and selection.
Right.
So that can work on any kind of substrate. It doesn't necessarily have to be carbon.
It's possible that it works on other things. Yeah. Those particular fine tuning facts were a quote from a paper.
Mm-hmm.
The specific ones that I really am referring to are the constants that cannot have deviations from them to an incredibly small amount. Otherwise, the universe doesn't. It has all sorts of problems. So,
but you don't know that. That's just an assertion. The
No,
universe
this is
has
actually
all sorts of problems as it exists now, but it would exist in a different state that you don't necessarily know if life could exist in that state.
So just to give like some examples, so like for instance, the strong nuclear force constant, if it was larger, no hydrogen would form. Atomic nuclei.
Yes, I know this.
Wouldn't form.
I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that the universe, as we know it, if these constants,
as we know it, you just said it.
Yeah,
as we know it.
Yeah.
It would form in a different way.
Maybe.
You don't necessarily know.
That you'd have to. Maybe you'd have to factor in like a probability. Again, this is a probability argument, right?
We'd be having this conversation in silicon-based life forms, talking about some other form of DNA, perhaps.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. Do you want to move on to Kalams? I feel like you've pretty well.
This one I know. Yes, exactly.
You've objected to this one pretty clearly. So let's move on to Kalams, because you actually had a pretty good responses to this.
Kalam is that's who came up with the Kalam cosmological argument? It's Kalam, right? That's his name.
I believe, but I want to double check. I want to make sure I give the person credit here.
David Sanderson nails it in the chat. He says the multiverse is a result of unicorn farts, and that is exactly correct. Scientifically quantifiable.
Okay, let me make sure
I did see your super chat too, and I will get to the super chats in the Q&A.
It was by a 11th century Muslim scholastic philosopher named Al-Ghazali.
Okay.
Yeah, so not Kalam's. Maybe that was his last name. I don't know. Okay, so the argument goes as follows. It's only three premises long.
Oh, nice. I like this.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning. The argument here is essentially that the most likely candidate for this cause would be a gential designer. Basically, you move from this argument to arguing that the most likely, because so the universe has to have a cause is the idea. And so because there's nothing before the universe starts, you would argue that cause is God, right?
Now, do you believe it's like cause and effect is a part of our understanding of the world, but there are arguments that there really is no cause and effect. Do you know any of those arguments?
I have not dove into that particular area of philosophy, so that's totally out of my wheelhouse.
So there's some types of math where the order that you place the figures into the equation will change the outcome. And you know this from
PEMDAS.
Addition you can put anything anywhere, and it's multiplication. I think I'm not a mathematician, obviously, but there's some types of math that you can like mix up the equation as much as you want and you still get the same outcome because it's not causally related. And evidently they found a way of doing computing that this kind of non-causal related computing is actually more efficient than cause and effect. So we may actually not live in a universe that's causally related. It may just be an illusion that we bring to the world through our senses. This is an argument that Don Hoffman has put forward in his latest book, A Case Against Reality, that the universe might actually not be causal related. And if it's not causal related, then obviously this argument, the premise one, I think, is incorrect, right?
Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
So I actually don't really know how to address. So like you're appealing to a lot of things that I don't have any way of verifying.
Well,
right?
I'm just trying to lay out an argument against your
oh no,
claim.
I totally understand what you're doing. I frankly don't know how to respond to like a lot of unknown stuff. Like yeah, so
I'll lay out the argument Don Hoffman puts out.
Yeah.
Don Hoffman's theory is that, and this is a pretty way out theory, so I'm not sure if it's correct or not, but he's saying that evolutionarily, and they've done this experiment in computer models, that if you're an organism that's fine-tuned to see the world as it actually is, you're going to be outcompeted by organisms that are just tuned to see fitness. So our perceptions of the world are fine-tuned to find what he calls fitness points. And this cause and effect understanding that we have of the world is because that's our perception of the world. But the world may not actually be that way. He actually, and I tweeted this out, I think you remember, like the ants perceive the world much differently than we perceive the world. That's easy for people to digest. But imagine if the real world is as different from what we perceive as our perceptions are from ants. Like the world could be that different from us because we are in effect animals.
Yeah.
So we could in effect be perceiving a causal related world that doesn't actually exist. Now that's as impossible for people to imagine as imagining colors that don't exist. Like, I say red and you can think of something, but if there are colors in the world that other animals can perceive that we can't perceive. So we don't see the infrared spectrum either.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So I guess I would respond to, if you want, you can bring in conversations. This is essentially like, I mean, you're basically talking about at the end there. You're talking basically about epistemology, like what can we know, verify, like. So like we have to make certain assumptions going into a conversation for the conversation to even function.
Cause and effect is one that generally people make, but at the
cause and effect is one.
At the subatomic level, though, cause and effect does not exist. At the quantum level,
I am not. I am not.
You know about the double slit experiment where they shoot particles through two slits, and
that's man, I'm not remembering the name right now, but I know what you're referring to. Yeah,
they can measure after the fact and determine which slit the particle went through.
Yeah,
by measuring.
Observation changes the way it behaves. If
yes,
I remember
so that's pretty strong evidence that cause and effect doesn't exist.
Well, I mean, that's not exactly true because the act of observation is the one that changes the. So I mean, there is a cause for the reason why it's.
Yeah, but the way Don Hoffman puts it, and this is fascinating, he says it's more akin to co-authoring.
What is?
Your perception is co-authoring what you're perceiving. Reality and you are collaborating on what is real.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, I get what you're
saying. So the cause is not really, I mean, they're equal parties. Observing it isn't causing it.
If you want to say that I'm making the assumption that there's cause and effect, that's fine. If you want to say that's an assumption, that's fine. But to have a conversation, we basically have to make that assumption.
Right. But if we make that assumption, you win the debate, and I want to destroy you. So I'm saying we shouldn't make that assumption. The same way we shouldn't assume that we don't live in a multiverse.
I guess the way I would respond to this argument is that basically say you come to a conversation and you give me an argument, and then my response is, okay, well, because you're making assumptions based on your axioms. So say that deductive reasoning works, and we don't know that deductive reasoning works or something like that, or we don't know that induction works, then you're actually making an assumption. Therefore, you have no reason for asserting X, Y, Z.
Mhm.
It's like, that's not even a you can't have a conversation.
We can move on to the because even if we assume premise one that, like, why would we assume God is the cause and not some other
because of the
force?
This is why I listed this one with the fine tuning argument, because the fine tuning argument argues essentially that because of the fine tuning facts, that the most likely candidate for those fine tuning facts is an agential designer. And then coupled with this argument that says that the universe has to have a cause, you would say, because of the fine tuning argument, it's most likely that if something were the cause of the universe, it would have to be the thing that set those fine tuning facts in place, which we already established was probably a god based on the fine tuning argument if you accept the fine tuning argument. So I like the coupling of the Kalam's cosmological argument with the fine tuning argument, because they support each other, is essentially the idea. So if you reject the fine tuning argument, then this argument may not convince you that the most likely candidate for the universe having a cause, that cause doesn't necessarily have to be God, if you reject the fine tuning argument, or if you reject the other parts. It may be the case that I'm only giving you half of the Kalam's cosmological argument. There's some other piece that I'm missing here, but that was my intention, was to support the Kalam's cosmological argument with the fine tuning argument.
Well, I understand now why you brought three arguments.
Yeah,
completely.
they all intertwine. That's the reason I brought them this way.
But none of them are empirical, though. They're all philosophical.
Sure. Yeah, but in order to, so here's the deal: the existence of God is not an empirical matter. You have,
because he's outside space and time, right?
Yeah, it's so even if he was in space and time, if he's all powerful, he could technically hide himself from methods of measurement. So there's not a way to address this question empirically. So we have to start discussing things philosophically and probabilistically, right? So that's the reason that I'm talking about these arguments. Now, I said at the beginning of the debate that these arguments are not why I believe in God, because frankly, I'm not sure that it's within the realm of rational, like, you can't, it's not something that's empirically verifiable, and because of that, it's basically based on your predetermined biases of whether or not you buy the arguments or not. If you like the idea of God existing, you're going to find the arguments for God existing more convincing, and you're going to find the arguments against God existing unconvincing. One of the reasons that I didn't find any of the arguments against God's existence in my philosophical education convincing at all. There's only a couple of them, and they're addressed in mainstream theological thought. So yeah.
Well, I like the idea of God, but it's still unconvincing. Like, why would you want, especially the God that is put forward in the Bible? Because, well, maybe not that God. That God,
yeah. See, you don't
that
like
God
him.
seems a little angry, but
yeah.
I'm wondering, because there's like the parallel to simulation theory. And simulation theory is there really would be a God, a creator of the universe, because they'd be the ones that created the simulation. And that terrifies me, completely terrifies me, because we don't know the motivation of the creator.
Yeah. That's scarier for sure.
In your situation, though, aren't we really in the same boat? Like, well, how do we know God's motivation?
Again, so if I would appeal to probably Anselm's argument. If we're talking about the best possible thing, I would hope that one of the characteristics of the best thing is that it's all good, or it's yeah. But you would have to. This is, again, you'd have to interpret that through like some sort of moral framework, right? Like, because best is like, you're automatically you're talking about normative and subjective stuff at that point. So that's a difficult conversation.
What do you think the motivation of God is?
The motivation of God?
Yeah, you believe in God. I don't believe in God. What do you think the motivation of God is?
Oh, I have no idea.
Really?
Probably good motivations, because I think he's all good.
Probably good.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, well, I would say that necessarily, in my view, they have to be good motivations.
Because of the description.
Because of the description of God as a perfect being, he would have to be good, in my view. And because of that, he would have to have good motivation. So if you look at Tom Jump's version of the best possible world, he thinks we should strive towards the best possible world. I believe that necessarily we have to exist in the best possible world now, because if God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, then we have to be in the best possible world. Otherwise, there's some sort of failing on the part of God, which is a contradiction. So Yeah.
I thought heaven was the best possible world.
No, the best possible world may be a world in which heaven exists, right? So like, but I don't think that heaven by itself may not be the best possible world, because if so if you like just have heaven and there's no frame of reference, right? So like it may be that the best possible world is one in which you live on earth and suffer, and then you go up to heaven and you're like, oh my god, this is the shit, right? So
Mhm.
like, you see what I'm saying? So like it may be the case that some amount of suffering or evil or whatever is necessary for the best possible world to exist. It may be that way. I think it actually is that way, because necessarily I believe that we do live in the best possible world. So it has to be the case that suffering is necessary to live in the best possible world, because it exists in this world. So
If you could be immortal, but you'd have to have all of your positions stripped from you, and they just dump you on the street corner like totally naked, but you knew you were going to be immortal. Like they take all your friends from you, they take everything away from you. You got nothing, starting from square one. Would you take that offer?
probably not.
Really? Oh my
Dude,
god, I would be like, I can
okay,
beat this. Are you kidding me?
okay, imagine that you live.
I'm immortal.
Imagine you're the way you are though right now. Okay, say you're immortal, and you have the same structure. It's just like you just don't die. Now imagine what happens in 2 million years. The world's gone, and you're just continuously suffocating in the vacuum of space because there's no oxygen, but you can never die. That sounds like shit.
Well, wait a second here. You turned it around on me. Like, are you thinking I'm asking you like the planet's going to be gone? I was thinking more like
Well, I mean, if you're immortal, you would be around when the planets are gone.
oh yeah. But you
It just
just
means
jump
that you're not,
around. You jump
huh?
around. Did you get off this rock sooner or later?
Yeah, you maybe. I don't know. What if climate change kills us in 5 years, dude? And
And
then
you're
you're the
all
last
alone.
one.
You're
And
like, oh my god, I made the worst
you're
decision of
all
my life.
alone and you're sunburnt for all eternity because it's so hot.
I would totally take that offer. I'd be like, I can beat
Oh
this. The
man.
question is, what do you say to that first person that you approach as you're naked with nowhere to go?
I don't know.
By the way, I'm curious. One of the things that the anti-theist theist debate keeps banding around is the idea, and I'm interested in this from the atheist perspective, because they're saying what would convince you that God exists, and no one's really asked me this question, but I don't necessarily know how to answer it. So I've been thinking, what would convince me of God? Like the cop out answer I always feel is, well, God would know what it is to convince me. But I
Yeah.
mean, I think I would be convinced, like if God just said, "Oh yeah, here's a time machine, let's go cruise around for a while," and
Yeah. So the typical
I'd be
response.
convinced. Like,
Yeah, I think the theist response with this is that it shouldn't be the case that it's easy to accept that God exists, because there's like, so we believe in like the Christian community at the very least. I don't know what the deal is with even I'll even quantify that. In most communities within the religious community, we believe in free will, because there are some that are deterministic, and I don't want to get into the compatibilist debate. I just don't want to do that. But because I believe in free will, I don't believe that God would come down and just like say like, oh, here's my hand, here's a gold bar, bang, like, and you'd be like, oh, so you're just God. Okay, like I think that would actually violate what you may want to do with your life. I think that it should be ambiguous and you should have a choice.
that's
You see what I'm
interesting.
saying?
It
Yeah, because
violates your free will.
so like, for example, there's one of the arguments against the existence of God is about evil, and so there's two divisions of the argument. There's one that's the logical problem of evil, and the one's the evidentiary problem of evil. The logical one's not good, it doesn't work. But the evidentiary problem of evil is basically like, there's all this evil in the world. If God's all good, why it seems unlikely that there would be this much evil if God's all good. And basically the response to that about human evil is the idea that, well, we have free will, so we are allowed to do crappy things to each other. So that gets rid of the human evil part. And then the response to things like say like hurricanes or something like that, or bad weather or disease or anything like that, would essentially be that these things basically have to take place randomly in the best possible world, in my view, because so like, say you said, I don't believe in God, and then bang, you were struck by lightning, you just die immediately, because the only way that something bad happens to you is because you don't believe in God. then there's a problem, because then you don't really have a choice. You're still being enforced by nature to believe in one thing. So that's why I don't even think that that's one of the more popular arguments for the against the existence of God. I still don't think it works. And yeah, so yeah, that's just addressing just the evil thing, because I bet people are asking about that. I have no idea. I'm not looking at
Their
that.
claim, though, is that they want to say, a lot of the theists want to say that we have all this great evidence for the existence of God, and the anti-theists are saying none of that is good evidence. It's all bad evidence. So they
That's a
jump to
value judgment, though, right?
yeah, totally. But they jump to the what would be good evidence, and if you can't give me what would be good evidence, then you really have an unfalsifiable claim. And that's why because even what I said about the time machine and that kind of thing, like a lot of the staunch anti-theists will say, well, it could be aliens. Aliens could have a time machine and they could come in. It could be the creator of the simulation, but wouldn't the creator of the simulation actually be God? I mean,
basically. And what was interesting is I was listening to your conversation the other day when y'all were talking about probability and stuff,
right?
And they were saying that like what atheists want is like a camcorder back in the day that can prove all these things.
Yeah,
happen,
I want my time machine.
No, if you gave them a camcorder, they would say it was falsified. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, it's not real. It's just it's something we made today that's supposed to look like. You see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. They'd say they always go to aliens before they go to God.
My basic contention here is that this is a decision, and you should make it whichever way that you think is the best for your life. And I don't think that this is why my position is not predicated upon these arguments. I think the point of me saying this is because there are arguments, there's legitimate philosophical disagreement. We should talk about them so maybe we get somewhere closer to the truth. So maybe the materialistic arguments get better by arguing against the theistic arguments or something like that, because even though each side is biased in their own way intuitively, it's still the case that by arguing back and forth, we're at least elevating, right? We're elevating the quality of our arguments. So I think it's important to engage in the conversations, but I don't think it's important because it's, like I said, it's not an empirical matter. Basically, it's false. It's the can I believe or must I believe distinction that Hyde always makes. It's like, do I have to believe there's a God? No. But can you? Yes. That's the problem. And this is the twisting that we do with our reasons. If we want to believe something, we say, can I believe it? You say yes. If you don't want to believe something, you say, must I believe it? And you say no. And that's because the evidentiary standard for you having to believe something is incredibly high. Incredibly high.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I can. I don't know that it's possible for me. So I have a super chat. The Wooster for $4.99 says, so this is basically like is there such a thing as a perfect circle question? It's very Platonic question. The form exists and does not, and the form exists and so does it. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't really know how to address the last part.
The form exists and so does it. I don't.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that.
No. He's saying the form exists, and so does it exist in reality? Like, if we can imagine a perfect thing, does it actually exist?
So I think the difficulty here would be. This is hard to think of on the fly.
This is also funny that Tom Jump is like that. He's all about the Platonic forms. He's like, yeah, if we can conceptualize it.
Okay, well, to be fair to Tom, I don't think he's about the Platonic forms. Our previous debate, just to hash things out and to clarify a bit, there was a sort of a miscommunication about like what my actual position was. So I went in arguing for a position that was almost undefensible, because what he can say is that in the realm of possibility, like almost like literally anything is possible. So he's saying it's possible that there are forms, like Platonic forms. Therefore, it's not impossible that objective morality would exist without God. So his position is that the forms exist. He's just saying it's possible that forms exist. Therefore, the position is immediately wrong that I was arguing for, because we're dealing with just such a wide scope of possibility. It's not, it just can't. It's indefensible. Just you could point out something like so. It may be unreasonable to believe that forms exist, but even if it's unreasonable and that we have evidence against it, it's still possible. That's why I asked in the debate, is it possible that we're made of cheese? And he said yes. That's no, yeah. I'm serious. This is the point of That's why it was
It is
framed.
possible.
It is possible. Exactly. That's why the conversation went that way.
Yeah, I like to
Yeah.
keep my conversations more grounded. So
I minored in philosophy because I liked all this stuff, and then as soon as I started reading more and more psychology, I stopped liking it. And I agree. I think I like to keep things more grounded now than I
yeah,
used to.
Height dunks on philosophers pretty hard.
Oh my God, he just
Yeah.
shreds them. Yeah, it's like no, you're just good rationalizers. Like that's it.
So
Yeah.
you're an empiricist as well, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no empirical way to discover God just by definition. So it makes it impossible. Well, do you have any? We're approaching an hour here. If anyone wants to shoot me any questions in the chat, I'll go ahead and answer them. You don't have to send a super chat. You just at me. Drew here is another moral foundations theory guy, and we were thinking of doing another stream on moral foundations theory.
Yeah, that would be so fun. I'm gonna have to read every like word Height has ever written in preparation for that.
Have you read the rational dog? It's the
Rational
emotional dog and its rational tail. That's his first
reread
paper.
I need to reread it. But I was actually doing research on that for that discussion, and I found an objection that is very problematic that I need to discuss and find out the details on, because if the paper is correct, then there's a problem with moral foundations theory, but I can't get a copy of the actual paper without buying it. And
I have the paper. I'll send it to you.
No, I'm talking about so there's a paper that suggests, there was a multicultural study across I think 27 countries, and they didn't find statistical significance among differences between the moral foundations or whatever, as I believe the conclusion of the study, but I can't evaluate the method or anything because it's locked behind a paywall. And even though I have access to a database through my grad school's library, I still don't have access to it. So I have access to almost like every research paper ever written.
Give us the argument against moral foundations theory. The basic argument in the paper.
The argument that the paper would make is the paper wasn't even technically trying to argue against it. It was just saying that they tested moral foundations theory among, I think, non-Western biased countries, is I think what they said, and they failed to find statistical significance. But I don't, again,
for the 6 moral foundations that they.
I don't even know, because I can't. All I have is the abstract. Like I can't actually even read what the results or the method. I can't read anything. So I'm trying to find a way to read it so I can actually address.
They're missing one foundation, the property rights one, that I think is going to become a moral foundation.
Maybe.
Yeah, we're so interested in possessions.
Yeah.
Animals aren't. So all right, no questions. I have a talk tomorrow with Inspiring Philosophy. We're going to watch some of Cosmic Skeptic made 2 videos on subjective morality. I'm going to attack Cosmic Skeptic's argument from a materialist perspective, and Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones over the Inspiring Philosophy channel, is going to attack from a theistic evolutionist perspective, theistic philosophical perspective, actually. Well, actually, he's a theistic evolutionist too. And I did a interview with Justin Brierley from Unbelievable that's going to be up on my channel probably by Friday. He shared with me a talk that he moderated with Brett Weinstein and Alistair. I can't remember the name of the theist. Sorry, guys. But that's going to be up on my channel. It was a fascinating interview. I went through my understanding of the evolutionary origin of religion, and he gave me his thoughts along the way. So it's a super interesting interview. So I'm stoked. I'll put that up on the channel by Friday.
A bunch of questions are popping up now.
Okay, what are they?
Yeah. Okay, so Adam, do you believe in the human soul, Drew 2? The answer for me is yes.
No.
Okay. Adam, how do you justify your empiricism? I guess the idea is, how do you justify like empirical method?
Yeah, see, you're right. You have to take, empiricism forces you to take things like cause and effect into, like, that has to be an axiom, otherwise empiricism doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's, that was essentially my response, is that, like, I mean, we could do this for anything. It's like
Yeah.
there's
Yes.
an axiom problem, obviously. It's like, it's basically just the case that there are axiom problems, and we'll just have to address other things other than the axioms. Otherwise, there's not even a conversation to take place.
Donald Hoffman puts it greatly because he says, you have to take an assumption before you can even begin. And that assumption always begins with magic because it's something that you just pluck out of the world.
Yeah.
Something like cause and effect is that magic. It's that something that you can't necessarily substantiate. A lot of the theists and anti-theists argue over various different things that are really that core axiom. Like recently Matt Dillahunty did a debate with Jay Dyer, and they were talking about logic and like logic is that piece of magic that they were plucking out of the air. And they were trying to say that logic, since logic exists, we have to believe that God exists. So I didn't really understand the argument that Jay was making, but it was an interesting debate. So yeah, everything starts with a bit of magic.
Yeah. See, there's the argument you used earlier that states that causality is an illusion requires evolution, which is a causal event, correct?
Yes, correct.
I think what he's saying is like, oh, okay, I see what he's saying. I think his idea is that you're saying that we evolved to have like perceptions that don't accurately describe reality. So it may be the case that we have this idea of cause and effect, but it doesn't exist. It's like an evolved perception. But his idea is like, wouldn't the
he's saying that
the fact that we evolved isn't that predicated on the idea that there's like cause and effect?
Right. He says if we get rid of the idea of cause and effect, then we don't have evolution.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So you're just okay. That was just a consistency question, I think, really.
Yeah, people love to target consistency. I actually target my consistency in the discussion with Jason Brierley, which is pretty interesting. So, but we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks for your questions. This was definitely an interesting discussion. Obviously, I don't know that these arguments. Someone in the chat was saying, these arguments are tired old arguments. So these arguments are.
But it does. I mean, it's not an objection. I mean, they could
definitely.
Yeah. I mean, the part of the problem, I think, is these arguments I don't think these arguments have been properly addressed. So like in terms of like Anselm's ontological argument, one of my favorite philosophy professors I had, I think he's at UT right now, but he's a theist, and he's like, this argument just works. And what happened is there was basically people accept the objections that are currently there. And because theists don't believe that the objections work, they're just going to keep arguing about the objections. Like, so like if Kant actually defeated the argument and everyone's like, okay, this argument doesn't work anymore, then people wouldn't bring it out anymore. But because it's like the opinion of like some philosophers that it hasn't been properly addressed and the objections to it don't actually work, they still think the argument stands. So it's going to keep getting brought up over and over and over again until someone thinks of an objection that properly kills the discussion on it, unlike the ones that are just like currently not satisfying for the theists. Does that make sense?
I like the arguments that they put forward in the Bible because they're like, yeah, I saw Jesus. That's how I know he rose again. Like, I hung out with him. I talked to him. Like, they're not this philosophical, if we can imagine something that's great, then in order to be great, it must exist. I mean, that argument seems circular to me, but
it's not the fact that we can imagine it. It's just the fact that it is the greatest thing. It would have to exist outside the mind. It only exist inside our mind.
That just seems like an assertion to me.
It's not, I promise. Like I don't possess the philosophical wherewithal or education to properly explain to you why this works, but it's formally valid, which just means that
this is how I got hooked on Jordan Peterson, because someone put a puzzle like this in my head. Like Jordan Peterson put the truth puzzle in my head, and I was like, what? It's like,
Yeah, and part of the reason I brought the typical objections to this argument is because it's not clear. What happens with people is like there's something fishy going on with this argument, but they can't actually like put
Yeah, it's a
their finger
puzzle.
on why
It's a
it is.
total
Yeah.
puzzle.
Let's see. It's not circular. It's logically valid, but really shit at convincing people. Yes, that's exactly right. Right P is correct. That's
Well,
exactly it.
I have learned something then, that
Yeah.
an argument can be can be true and totally unconvincing.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, the you know what's interesting is do you know who Michael Knowles is from the Daily Wire?
Yeah, I can't
He
stand
was
that guy. But
converted by that argument, which is crazy.
now I have another reason to not like that guy.
You don't like that? I think he's a little too red meat for me.
Yeah,
Like a little too much on the Trump train.
he's mean.
I don't think he's mean. I just think he's silly. That's
Well,
exactly it.
I have learned.
That's a topic for another time, I think.
All right, I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks for
Yeah.
joining in. Thanks for the super chat, and we will see you guys in the next video.